At its core, what makes a figure drawing work is the gesture, the forms, and the values. That's how you bake the cake, right? The skill we're going to talk about today is more like the icing on the cake. But this skill gets a lot of hype and attention because this skill is when the drawings really start to look good. So, you could be building really important skills, really important fundamentals, but the drawings still don't have that aesthetic appeal that you really want. But then when you add this final little thing, that's when they really start to look the way you want them to look, which is why it's quite a fun skill to talk about. What am I talking about? I'm talking about edges, and I'm talking about mark making. So how you vary the edges in your drawing and how you make those edges with the material that you're using. All right, so to get into it, we're going to look at some beautiful paintings and drawings by other artists, and then I'm going to do a demo and use all of those ideas, and we're going to figure this whole thing out. So we're going to look at this watercolor by Jared Cullum. You can have edges that vary in a few different ways. So an edge could be very hard, like a very sharp transition from light to dark, for example. Or it could be very soft. So it could go from light to dark, but very gently and softly. The other way it can vary is in how big the jump in value is. So it could be from very dark to very light, like a big contrast, a big change in value. Or it could be a low contrast edge. So it could go from light to, a bit lighter, or dark to a bit darker. So it'd be low contrast or high contrast or everything in between. So when we're looking at this, we could see that there are some edges which are very soft and low contrast, like right up here in the sky, as we see the trees transition to the sky. The contrast is very low. They're both basically gray and like quite close in value. The sky is very slightly lighter than the tree. And also the edge is very soft. It's that wet in wet watercolor technique where it just really fades. This tree fades into the sky. So it's a very low attention seeking edge, right? On the other hand, the snow on the roof of this barn or whatever it is, we've got high contrast because it goes from very light to quite dark right there. And it's a pretty hard edge. And so a lot of attention is going there, which is by design. I'm guessing Jared really wanted a lot of attention in this area, and that's why the contrast is higher and the edges are sharper. So now let's look at this beautiful figure drawing by Vinilis. He's really pushed these ideas around edges. And let's think about the edges in the shadows. I bet you there was a lot of stuff going on in the shadows. Like I bet that there was all kinds of stuff happening with the collarbones coming up, probably pockets of real dark in the armpit, that kind of stuff. And I bet that these edges here were much more clearly defined in the reference. But the artist, Vinilis, has made this choice to get rid of most of those edges. So now this is all just faded into one value with no transitions, no edges at all. It's just one big shape. And then for the outline, yes, there's the hint of an outline, but he has dialed down that edge to be very low contrast and very soft. And what does that do? It brings all the attention to this edge and this shape on that core shadow where the light meets the dark. That's where all the attention's going, to these beautifully designed shapes. And so that is the artist. You're the artist. So you can do whatever you want with your edges. And in this case, Vinilis has majorly dialed down the information in the shadows and brought all the attention to the edges between the light and the dark. All right, let's look at Sasha Hartzliev's painting. There's a few things in this painting that our eyes are drawn to, right? One of them is not the back of the chair, right? Because that's not really what this painting is about. But the back of the chair is still there. It still feels real. So the reason I wanted to bring this up is because sometimes I think we're afraid to dial down edges. We want to define things like it, we want to like really clearly make it obvious, like this is a chair. This is the shape of the chair. So we want to make it real, like in your face with a strong edge on it so we can really see it. But it still feels like a chair even though that edge, I mean, let's take a look at this edge. Look at how low contrast and soft that edge is. It goes from dark to slightly less dark. And then as you travel up the edge, it just disappears completely. Like there's no edge now between the chair and the shadow behind it. But it doesn't feel any less real because I can't really see it. I can fill in the blank off this. So this tiny bit of contrast just in this section is enough to really make this whole back of the chair feel very solid. And because Sasha Hartzliev has done that, this chair edge now is not robbing the attention away from the focal areas, the stronger, clearer edges around the face and around the painting that the artist is doing. Even in this lamp could have dominated this painting because it's so bright, but the edges, it's kind of like it's melting into the glowing light that it's emitting. And so it doesn't have it's a very bright lamp. It's a big part of the painting, but it's not overbearing because the edges have been dialed down so much. So this is a gouache painting by Karen Brandenburg, which I really like a lot. And you know what? A lot of the edges in this painting are, I would say, fairly hard. They're not like watercolor melting away or anything. They're softer up here in the background and lower contrast too. Within the wave, they are lower contrast. The value is all, if you kind of squint at it, it's all in the same value range here, which is great. There's a lot more, hard edges and contrast there. But there's also something else, which is the complexity of the edge and the detail in the edge is higher here. And that to me is why a lot of attention goes there. Because across the painting, everything is pretty simple. It's almost got this simple pattern, simple kind of stripes to it. And then that gets broken up by this, literally the wave breaking, bringing out that complexity. And that's why I think the attention comes there. All right, beautiful paintings. Okay, this is such a fun topic. I hope you enjoy it as much as me. Check out more and more paintings and see how those edges vary. It's the icing on the cake. It's the fun bit, right? So here I'm doing a figure drawing, right? And, all the standard things that we talk about a lot is a lot of what's on my mind with this drawing. So in other words, this isn't about edges. I'm thinking about the building blocks of the drawing being, okay, there's the rib cage, but there's the pelvis. And then that creates a squash here and a stretch here. And so that's the heart and soul of this pose. And then from there, I'm going to think about, okay, this shoulder comes off this way, but this one is pivoted up. And then everything that's going to the pivoted up one is going to stretch up to there. So I want to get that. I can see this bigger kind of simple gestural curve of the arm there. I've got a foreshortened thigh. I've got this outward curve on the shin. In terms of the values, I've got big, simple shapes of light and dark because there's one light source. Some planes are facing the light and some aren't, and that creates big, if I close one eye and squint, big, simple shapes of shadow, right? And so those are the building blocks of the drawing. That's what I'm really thinking about as I build up this drawing. But then if I'm feeling good about that, if I've done that study, if I've done those exercises, I'm feeling good about that, then I can start to think as well about, okay, how am I going to vary these edges and bring attention to things that I want to bring attention to? Now, the way that you're going to vary the edges is not just about the composition and where you want the attention to go. The other thing that it's going to do, especially in a figure drawing, is going to help us explain how the form is turning. So if you have, like a box or something like that, or something with a very sharp corner on it, then the edge is going to have to be quite sharp, right? Because it's just going to go from a plane that's getting hit by light to a plane that's not getting hit by light. So a very sharp transition. Whereas if it's a more rounded transition, then I'm not going to have probably such a hard edge. I'm going to have a gentler edge. So So like maybe I can airbrush some kind of gentle edge, right? You know what I mean. A much gentler edge because it's a wrap like across the thigh or something. It's gently going to turn away from the light, so my edge might be a bit more gentle. So then the question is, all right, how does that apply to a figure? Well, along something that's quite bony, the edge is often going to be a bit harder because the bone might stick out and create a sharper corner. Whereas across something kind of rounded, like, you know, a thigh like we talked about, or something like that, the edge might become a bit softer. But then that might not match where I want the attention to be drawn. So like here in this reference, along the shin, oops, I'm still on airbrush, along the shin here, it's a pretty hard edge because the shin is kind of pointy, right? The shin kind of has almost a triangular shape to it. And so light just hits one bit and then doesn't hit the other bit. And so I get a sharp edge, and you can see that here. It's a pretty sharp edge between the light and the dark. But I might not want a lot of attention to be drawn to the shin. So what I can do is I can just keep the edge fairly hard, but dial down the contrast. You know, I can just reduce the contrast there. And maybe I want a lot of attention to be drawn to the shadow shapes up here, and then I'll dial up the contrast. But I might still make some of the edges quite soft, but as long as they're high contrast, they'll be attracting some attention. So quite often for me, I'm going to build up the drawing and then realize later on, I've got too many strong contrast edges in here. There's too much going on in this drawing, too much attracting attention, and then dial down some of the edges and maybe dial up some of the edges, or break or lose some of the edges, and then emphasize other edges. So it's all part of the process as you're looking at it. So a big question obviously is, okay, even if I know what edges I want to make, how do I actually make them? Like, how do I put that down on the paper? And so that's going to vary depending on your material, right? So in this case, I'm using smooth newsprint. I'm using a Pitt pastel pencil, and I've sharpened it so that a lot of the lead is exposed. And then I sanded the lead down so that I get this like long tapering exposed bit of lead. Then, as you can see, I can apply the side of that, and I can apply all of it to get a big wide mark, or I can apply just a thin bit of it to get a narrow mark. So I can vary the width of it that way. And then it's about being able to draw really, really light or really, really hard. Most people draw too hard. I always used to make my marks way too hard. So it's about practicing allowing the pencil to just skim across the surface of the paper. It's more about being good at drawing light because it's really easy to draw hard. You just push harder, but it's the lighter drawing that for me took a lot of practice to get that, you know, that muscle memory there. Now, one thing I'll have to point out here is that you can't really fast forward to this bit, right? So if we're gonna make a cake, you can't just fast forward to the icing. Ultimately, you do have to work on your gesture, your forms, and your value skills. And there's other tutorials we have about those more fundamental ideas. But once you've got those things dialed in and you're feeling confident with them, then you can really play with the edges and how you make the marks and stuff like that. Now here I'm using a Conte crayon, and I'm trying to bring out some background tone. And there's two reasons for that. One is it's going to contrast more strongly with the lit parts of the figure if I can darken the background behind them. And then two, I can put it in places where I want to dial down the contrast. So maybe there's some shadow there on the figure. I can put some shadow behind the figure, and now that edge is a low contrast edge because it's just shadow against shadow. And maybe I want a lot of attention to come to that shape of light that's hitting her rather than onto the shadow shapes. Just to go with the point I was making earlier, the way that you do your edges is really personal about how you want to design the image, and you can make great pictures with just all hard edges or without varying the edges too much, or just varying the edges a little bit. So I really love this artist on Instagram. I think his name is Richard James, but the Instagram handle is Colored Mud. And you can see a lot of the shapes have pretty hard edges. Sometimes they're broken, but ultimately a lot of them are hard edges, but playing with varying the value contrast and things, they look great. The paintings look great. So you can make great paintings and drawings without that much edge variation, but it's really, really fun to play around with these different types of edges. So I really recommend it once you've got those other skills in place. So this ends up being the final drawing. I was super happy with it. It's a ton of fun.
If you like our tutorials and you're learning to draw figures, you're gonna love this PDF guide. It gives you all the skills that you need to work on in order, and then asks you questions to figure out which skill you need to work on next, and then gives you links to the tutorials you need to learn those skills. We've also got a free mini course. It's a 10-day course. It is super powerful and effective. And for your regular figure drawing practice, we have tons of free references you can use in our free reference library. The link to all this stuff is below. To learn more about how to see and design those shadow shapes we talked about in this video, I've put a really awesome tutorial on the screen. So check it out and I'll see you there.